Center for the Study of World Religions, Harvard Divinity School.
Next up, we have Paja Faudree, who is a professor of anthropology and linguistics at Brown University, whose paper will be Tales from the Land of Magic Plants, Indigenous People, Psychedelic Science, and the Violence of Discovery. Then we have Maria DeMargo, researcher at the Institute of Contemporary History in Lisbon, who will be talking about Portugal, psychedelic, rye, Ergot, and the witch as historical object. And then we have Jason Holschler, professor of interdisciplinary art at Georgian Southern University, whose paper will be Tripping the Aesthetic Singularity, Psychedelics as Complex Adaptive Information Technologies.
Can I move this?
Yes.
Thanks. Oh, hey man, what's happening?
Hey.
Hi, everybody. Everybody can hear me okay? Super. So I was speaking at the Promise of Life, Spiritual Traditions, and Biotechnology Futures held under the auspices of the Harvard Kennedy School in September of 2024. During lunch, I overheard two people talking about whether ego dissolution, the experience of anatman, the Buddhist no-self doctrine, was possible via psychedelics. One said that he was curious, and the other, an expert in Buddhism, said it was not possible. Something about the way that this latter person spoke made me think that he'd never done psychedelics before, and his claim was an empty one. I jumped in. I overheard your conversation, and I completely disagree. Ego dissolution is possible with DMT and 5-MeO. Thinking about getting some street cred, I added, I vape both. The curious person asked me for my card and invited me to be on Pulse and forever change my life. I don't see him here, but that person is our very own Mason Marks. But do I have credibility merely because I vaped both? Have I just lost my credibility by sharing with you that I have? Psychedelics have rapidly re-entered public discourse in recent times. Clinical trials, venture capital, therapy training programs, and popular media have produced a surge of commentaries and interpretations. Alongside scientists and scholars, many self-appointed experts have emerged. Every speaker here in this panel and in all of the panels here claims to be an authority. Every speaker claims to be an authority. Who ought to be recognized as an authoritative knower of psychedelic experience? This is fundamentally a problem in epistemology. Who gets to count as a knower in psychedelic discourse? Users claim experiential authority, scientists claim biomedical authority, and public intellectuals claim interpretive authority. Psychedelic discourse has produced a crowded epistemic marketplace in which authority is often performed rather than established through disciplinary rigor. Competing claims to authority. There are two main models at work: experiential authority versus clinical or biomedical authority. Individuals may have experience as credentials that place them in both categories. There may also be individuals who believe that they are exceptions to this taxonomy. To counter this, these two models are best understood as ideal types and useful heuristic devices for the purpose of this talk. Experiential authority. First, experiential authority is the belief that those who ingest psychedelics possess privileged knowledge, even if it is noetic, as I shared that fateful Cambridge conference fall 2024. These include psychonauts, underground guides, retreat facilitators, and patients in clinical trials. The problem is identical to ones relating to the epistemology of religious experience. Do subjective experiences give one a unique kind of knowledge or provide evidence for, say, the existence of God? And are these experiences self-authenticating, or do they require external validation? Which begs the question, what makes the external validators valid? Epistemic certainty is sought to avoid, in the Sanskrit, anavastha, infinite regress. Epistemic certainty is mere swataha pramanya, again a Sanskrit term, self-validation. Even granting epistemic authority to firsthand experience, is there a hierarchy among psychonauts? Does more experience produce greater authority? Or simply different experiences produce great authority? Does an obscure psychedelics produce more credibility? Or a dangerous psychedelic? Is iboga more authoritative than psilocybin then? And most importantly, who decides the psychedelic pecking order? Right? Who decides that? I could get more street cred and tell you about the stuff I've done, but at any rate. Clinical or biomedical authority. If experiential authority says, I know because I've experienced, biomedical authority says, we know because we have measured. Foucault characterizes biomedical authority as founded on the preeminence of the medical gaze, where the patient is seen not as a person, but as a biological body that can be managed, manipulated, and quantified. This requires the accumulation of data, repeatable evidence, experiments, and so on. Evidence-based medicine is where authority is derived from rigorous peer-reviewed clinical trials and systematic data. Biomedical authority is claimed by neuroscientists, psychiatrists, and clinical researchers, legitimized through clinical trials, peer review, and regulatory oversight. Yet, conflicts of interest and funding pressures can make this data suspect, as I am sure you will all agree. Oh, I said that here. There is the pharmaceutical funding and lucrative biotech startups that point towards conflict of interest. Thus, biomedical authority is most certainly not neutral. And then there are those who claim authority in both worlds. More troublesome are those who have clinical biomedical authority, but remain in the closet about their experiential authority. But one must ask, how clinical biomedical authority was established in the first place? Was it self-proclaimed? And if there's a governing body that establishes authority, it begs the question, who establishes their authority? Claims and credibility. As you can guess, I am deeply skeptical of all claims for authority. I am a mere searchlight casting for faults in the clouds of delusion. My job is to shed light, not to master. Those who claim authority, no matter experiential or biomedical, are doing so within humanly created criteria about what constitutes evidence. While there are indeed problems with Wittgenstein's theory of language, the so-called language games, I think, is useful in this context. To this end, Wittgenstein proposes that there are forms of life, I'm sure many of you know about this already, cultural contexts and communities that share language, practice rituals, and so on. These are not unregulated. Rather, they are enacted and produced according to the rules, a grammar, as it were, and lexicon that is particular to a specific form of life, or to extend this metaphor, a game. Sentences produced in these language games must be evaluated and understood only in the designated and intended framework. To assess a sentence in one language game using the grammar rules lexicon of another does not make sense. There may be an overlap, but in many, nothing is shared. Wittgenstein warns, when philosophers use the word knowledge, being, object, I, proposition, name, and try to grasp the essence of the thing, one must always ask oneself, is the word ever actually used in this way in the language game which is its original home? He's even more explicit in his lectures and conversations on aesthetic psychology and religious belief. He states, in a religious discourse, we use such expressions as, I believe that so-and-so will happen, and use them differently to the way that we use them in science. Although there is great temptation to think we do, because we do talk of evidence and do talk of evidence by experience. And furthermore, suppose someone says, I believe in the last judgment. And I say, well, I'm not so sure, possibly. You would say there's an enormous gulf between us. If he said there's a German plane overhead, and I said, possibly, I'm not so sure, you'd say we were fairly near. Religious belief is not merely a weaker or stronger empirical hypothesis. It belongs to a different form of life. And finally, Wittgenstein says, it isn't a question of my being anywhere near him, but on an entirely different plane. Here he emphasized that religious belief and scientific discourse operate with different criteria of meaning and justification. Experiential and biomedical authorities are speaking within different language games, each governed by distinct grammars of evidence, credibility, and meaning. What counts as knowledge or evidence is not neutral. It is shaped by institutions and social frameworks. Claims about psychedelics are being made within different language games, each with its own rules for what counts as evidence or knowledge. Disagreement is not simply about truth versus falsity. It's about different conceptual frameworks. Authority claims in psychedelic discourse are unstable because 1, multiple language games are operating simultaneously. 2, each claims legitimacy. 3, each defines evidence differently. 4, power structures decide which language game dominates. The result is epistemic instability. There is no single framework that fully controls the discourse. As Wittgenstein later observed, at the foundation of well-founded belief lies belief that is not founded. Biomedical and experiential authorities alike rely upon leaps of faith. Wittgenstein helps us see why experiential and biomedical authorities talk past one another. They operate within different language games with different grammars of evidence and meaning. But which of these language games becomes dominant is not determined philosophically. It is determined socially and institutionally. I expect that everyone is familiar with theorization about how credibility is ranked. Though my orientation is Foucauldian, I'm especially indebted to Miranda Fricker, who writes that, quote, epistemic injustice occurs when someone is wronged in their capacity as a knower. There are 2 kinds of epistemic injustice, testimonial and hermeneutical. According to Fricker, quote, testimonial injustice occurs when prejudice causes a hearer to give a deflated level of credibility to a speaker's word. Did I lose or gain credibility in your eyes when I shared that my knowledge of DMT and 5-MeO was firsthand? Fricker's idea of hermeneutical injustice is highly relevant for psychedelics. Quote, hermeneutical injustice occurs when a gap in collective interpretive resources puts someone at an unfair disadvantage in making sense of their social experience. Indigenous people operating in different language games can lose epistemic authority when their experiences cannot be expressed in dominant frameworks. Similarly, do clinical trials dictate the language for what purportedly is ineffable? Fricker's work shows that credibility and authority are socially constructed. Expertise is not just about knowledge, it's also about who is granted credibility. In practice, neither model fully explains who gets authority. Instead, authority often emerges from charisma, narrative performance, and capital, more like influencer culture than scholarship. And it is to this model that I will now turn. The psychedelic influencer. Many contemporary psychedelic experts resemble cultural influencers more than disciplinary authorities. Their authority emerges through storytelling, personal narrative, podcast circuits, conference appearances, and social media visibility. Figures such as Michael Pollan and historically Terence McKenna search as mediators for psychedelic meaning, translating experience for broader audiences, and lucrative book contracts and speaking engagements. But their authority often rests less on methodological expertise and more on charisma, narrative skill, and cultural capital. Many self-proclaimed experts function less like regular scholars and more like influencers or minor celebrities who cultivate followings, curate personas, and perform authority rather than embody it. This represents the third model of authority and arguably the most worrisome. Psychedelic expertise is socially performed and economically mediated rather than epistemically secured. Social media-based epistemic authority operates different from experiential or biomedical authority. It inhabits a distinct language game with its own criteria for what counts as evidence and success. Influencers both bridge and distort language games. They translate insider knowledge for the public, but often flatten complexity or prioritize sensational narratives. There is a drive to deploy and accumulate, in Bourdieu's framework, cultural capital. Authority is indexed to a metrics of visibility, namely how many followers one has, how many books one has sold, and how many podcast downloads one has. Influencers may present themselves as daring participant observers who engage psychedelics and thereby create a credibility in the eyes of their audiences. Pollen is a classic example of this, like a particular and peculiar New York Times East Coast audience. This immersive mode is highly performative and offers consumers the feeling that they can experience these adventures vicariously, safely living dangerously through the eyes of someone like themselves, a kind of gonzo-style journalism for the left-leaning yet culturally cautious New York Times reader. I'm reminded of colonial explorers entertaining nobility in English salons with their stories of heroic adventures. With stories of heroic adventures, they captivate their audiences. In their immersion, they may even attempt to supplant those who claim experiential authority, whether psychonauts or indigenous practitioners, returning as self-styled shamans or self-authorized spokespeople. Such influencers may also undermine or override those with biomedical authority, or worse, deliberately circulate misinformation, often driven by cherry-picked data, sensationalized media, or AI-generated falsehoods. Psychedelic influencers create new epistemic hierarchies based on popularity rather than evidence. This could thus exacerbate testimonial or hermeneutical injustice by amplifying certain voices while sidelighting others, all for the sake of increasing their commercial marketability. I could offer examples of people like this, but you know who they are. And it may also be that you are one of them. Expertise in this domain is not only unstable, but also shaped by improvisational, economically inflected practices of self-legitimation. Influencer authority is commodified, podcasts, retreats, speaking fees, books, NFTs, etc., shaping claims to knowledge. Economic incentives shape what counts as authoritative. Very short conclusion. Psychedelic discourse today is crowded with competing authorities. Psychonauts, some of you are that, I'm sure. Scientists, perhaps, and cultural influencers. Each claims legitimacy, but authority is rarely secured by knowledge alone. Rather, it is performed, narrated, and shaped by social and economic forces. Just as I began this talk by admitting I vaped 5-MeO and DMT, credibility is rarely straightforward. It depends as much on who listens as on who speaks. In this new epistemic marketplace, the loudest voice often wins, not the most rigorous one. So whether you are a psychonaut, a scientist, or an influencer, or all three, remember, sometimes expertise is measured in followers, not facts. Thank you.
Oh yeah, the slant is tough. That's very.
Am I supposed to talk into this? Can you guys hear me okay? All right. Thank you. I want to start by thanking the organizers and the sponsors, but I especially want to thank Paul Gillis-Smith, because the deadline for these papers happened just at the same time that the Brown shooting happened, which is where I happen to teach. So I was pressed to sort of get my stuff in, and you were incredibly encouraging, and I just wanted to say thank you, especially because I'm here and I'm happy to be here, but also because this is the first psychedelic conference I've ever spoken at. In fact, it's the first psychedelic conference I've ever attended. And the reason why sort of colors my whole approach. So let me say a little bit about that. So I start not with a sort of a commitment to psychedelics per se, but to the people that live here in the Sierra Mazateca, which is famous for its mushrooms, but also, as you will see, another plant I'll talk about in just a minute. People there speak Mazatec. They're sometimes referred to as Mazatec people. I'm going to use the term people of the Sierra. I'm happy to explain later why I use that particular term. But I started there initially because I was interested. I'm a linguistic anthropologist by training, and I went there because I was interested in some really interesting things that were happening there that people were doing to revitalize their language. And they were doing it kind of from a grassroots perspective, not from the perspective of strong government support. So my first book was about language revitalization in the region. It's one of many articles I wrote about it. And I spent a lot of time there talking to a lot of people, and it became kind of my second home. So this is one research assistant, a really good friend that I work with a lot, but I have compadres there. I go there every year. My kids were partially raised there. I'm really committed to the region. So that's kind of, and most importantly, the people who live there. So that's kind of where my interest in psychedelics stems from. What I'm going to be talking about today is a slice of a forthcoming book. It's one of two books on this plant, known to scientists as Salvia divinorum, to many other people as simply salvia, but to people in the Sierra, mostly as pastora. There are a couple of other words, but leaf of the shepherdess is how it's often translated. And my interest in that plant came about in part because of things like this, because of its commercialization. And in particular, it's, I'll come back to that in a minute, it's the ongoing process by which Sierra people were, from my perspective, really being erased from the story about salvia. So the name of the book is Magic Mint, Psychedelic Plants, Indigenous People, and the Violence of Discovery. So I riff on the title of my talk, which really looks at the semiotic, this sort of representational, the narrative dynamics, but also the material dynamics surrounding this particular plant and the stories that are told about it. Which is endemic to one spot on the globe, which is to say the Sierra Mazateca. So that map sort of maps, the blue is sort of speakers of Mazatec, and the dots are examples of live, thought to be possibly wild. That's a whole other conversation I can't get into right now. Specimens of Salvia divinorum worldwide, in other words, outside of botanical museums, et cetera, et cetera. So as you can see, there's a very close relationship between people who speak this particular language, who live in this part of the world, and the endemic scope of this particular plant. So from my perspective, although I'm going to talk quite a bit about psilocybin today too, salvia is a special case. Capastor is a special case because of this really unique relationship between the people and the plant, which I think is helpful for launching a larger conversation about the place of indigenous people in psychedelics. My interest in this was not about psychedelics per se. It was like, I just got mad. I got so frustrated at the way people who had taken care of this plant for such a long time were being systematically erased. And by taking care of it, I mean things like, for example, for those of you who don't know this story, during the Inquisition, people who used psychedelic plants, I'm sure many people know this, were violently persecuted and sometimes executed. So the idea that people continued to use this plant over such a long period of time was really important to me. It says to me that they have a certain claim that they can lay on the plant, that it just was an affront to me that they were being so systematically erased from the story about the plant. Furthermore, and this, I'm not going to go into too much detail about this, but the plant often relies very heavily on human propagation. So it really relies on people to reproduce the plant in many cases. That's the way it's most commonly reproduced. So that's kind of where I started. I was kind of really interested in this story about the plant. And in particular, I wanted to understand better this process by which people who had been so central to the plant's history were actually systematically erased by so many of the public narratives told about the plant. So the book is kind of structured outside in. It looks at the most public narratives about the plant. And then it sort of takes them apart one by one, looking through these different layers at which this kind of process of erasure happens. So that is kind of where the book comes from. I will say that a central thing that I'm doing in the book is to really foreground, although the political economy is really crucial, is to foreground narratives and the particular process by which stories are told and the ways narrative grooves get formed, particular sedimented narratives that shape the history of this plant and many plants as a general term. But I'm particularly interested in tracing it in the context of this particular plant. So that's kind of where I started, or to sort of gloss it briefly, the world is made of stories, not of atoms. Stories are very important. Okay, so that's kind of where I'm coming out with the book. What I'm going to talk about today is, and I should say it's based on a lot of archival research, a lot of oral history, and a lot of research done here at Harvard. And I thought really hard about talking about that part of the book today, but I'm mostly not going to talk about the archival stuff because I want to encourage you to rethink a particular story that you've probably heard before and to think about it differently. So in particular, it has to do with a story having to do with these two men, which are probably familiar to many of you. That's Gordon Wasson in the foreground. That's Albert Hofmann in the background. Gordon Wasson, who is widely known as the person who discovered or rediscovered psilocybin and introduced it to the West. He's also the person who is widely credited for having discovered Ska Pastora as well. And Albert Hofmann, the sort of discoverer of LSD, they collaborated, as is widely known, on the early scientific research having to do with psilocybin. It's less widely known how they were also involved in the history of Ska Pastora, I would say. And in particular, on a trip that they took to the Sierra to find specimens that would be suitable for botanical identification, they wound up encountering, having an event happen that has been widely told. And so I'm going to just read from Hoffman's account of this from his book, LSD, My Problem Child. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how this narrative has been remobilized. And then I'm going to critique it. And then I'm going to sort of put that in the context of something having to do with Ska Pastora, even though this whole story happened in the context of trying to gather knowledge about Ska Pastora in particular. So a day later, we made our formal visit to the curandera Maria Sabina, famous shaman that Sabia that Gordon Wasson again discovered, a woman made famous by Wasson's publications. It had been in her hut, and I want to say that is one thing I'm just going to pause on for just a minute, because that is part of what I'm talking about when I talk about sedimented discourse, right? That whole notion of a hut, of dirt floors, hut, man, like do a word search, and you will see that word come up over and over and over again. What does that word do? Among other things, it encourages us to forget it's somebody's home. It encourages us to see them as different from us. It's an otherizing move, and it happens so quickly, I think most people just look right past it, right? And that's part of my point, is that I want you to slow down and look more carefully at these narratives that you've heard a bazillion times and think more carefully about what the ethical stakes are that are embedded in them. Okay, so it had been in her hut that Gordon Wasson became the first white man to taste of the sacred mushrooms. The old curandera had an intelligent face, exceptionally changeable in expression. She was, I fear that I'm already running out of time, so I'm going to sort of skip ahead and just say that as you probably know, one of the things that happened I'm not going to read all the huts. The hut comes up 3 or 4 times in this particular passage, which is why I quoted at such length. But the point is that that Hofmann had extracted psilocybin, had synthesized it. His company Sandoz had patented it as indicybin, which is to say this, and it was being marketed. And he brought some to Maria Sabina, who, in a famous quote said, ultimately, and I'm skipping ahead a little bit, the spirit of the mushrooms was contained in the pills, right? A story, how many of you heard that story? Like everybody, right? It's an incredibly common story. Sorry, I should have showed this slide earlier. This is the article that was written about the kind of discovery of Ska Pastora, and it talks a little bit about this trip, although not that particular narrative. Okay. How does this story get mobilized? How have you guys heard it? Well, there's a number of different ways that happen. So this is a film, for example, that is in production. It's not even out yet, but as you can see, it sort of shows Maria Sabina and Hoffman. So one of many reproductions of this particular narrative. I mean, most famously, I would say, and also having a great deal of spread, would be Pollan's work, for example. So let me quote for you briefly from Pollan's work. So from How to Change Your Mind, he talks about the 62 trip during which the chemist gave Maria Sabina psilocybin in pill form. She took 2 of the pills and declared that they did indeed contain the spirit of the mushroom. And I should say, he talks about her dirt basement, maybe not a hut, but it's the same idea in the book, from Netflix. So there's this narration where he talks about one of the most amazing stories in the history of psychedelics, which is to say, Watson's sort of discovery of mushrooms. And in this context, Hoffman presented Maria Sabina with the pills, which are now used in research. She ingested them and declared that they were the same spirit as the mushrooms. I'm going to read a little bit more just because this is part of what I'm talking about when I talk about narrative grooves. Maria Sabina has become a legend. She's a grandmother of psychedelics in a way. It should also be said, Maria Sabina came to regret having introduced Watson to the mushrooms because it had a profound effect on her town. Influx of hippies, et cetera, et cetera. Ultimately, it's back to Pollan's narrative, and he says the town turned against her. Her house was burned down. Her family was subjected to violence. Ultimately, she died destitute. She suffered tremendously as a result of having introduced the world to the magic mushroom. And then the music gets happy again. And he says, but her legacy would live on, right? I mean, so what does that do? And I should point out that one of the interesting things about this is that I mean, there's a growing body of research on sort of decolonization and psychedelics, including some really important work written by people in this room. It is interesting that this particular story does not show up very much in that body of the literature. I think in part precisely because of this difficult place of having to reckon with the fact that Maria Sabina seems to have a positive reaction, right? But I still want to sort of dwell on the story for just a minute, but I want to take 1 minute to just point out what that particular story does, right? The one that Pollan retells. What does it do? Who's to blame? The townspeople. Those are the only people that get singled out for any blame. And ultimately, it's to the benefit of all the rest of us that she was willing to make this sacrifice, is how the tale is framed, right? Okay, so if I back up for just a minute to come back to, and I want to point that it's very important that he acknowledges the harm, but it does something else very important, the way that harm is acknowledged, which is to say it's entirely located in the past. It's all about something that happened in the past, and there are no present entailments for what happened to Maria Sabina, for what happened to her town. What happens when you have a plant that people have been taking care of for a very, very long time, for centuries, become separated? And I mean, in the case of Ska Pastora, people from the Sierra show up even less, I would say, in the narrative about the past of Ska Pastora than they do in the history of psilocybin. So it's a particularly egregious sort of separation at that level. So my point would be how this story is generally told is all wrong. How is this story generally told? Well, I would say it's told in a very small way, as I already mentioned, in this kind of decolonization literature, but it's mostly told through a triumphal narrative, right? It's about the triumph of science, the ability of science to do this miraculous thing. Sometimes it comes up in the context of this naturalization versus synthetic debate. It also comes up in the conversation of particularly in I would say in wellness spheres, of the kind of the miraculous. It's a story of enchantment, a story of wonder and amazement. But what that does, I would say, is just completely look past the reality of what this is, which is that it's a form of theft. It's a form of theft. I mean, let me give you an analogy, and I invite you to give me a better one if you come up with one, but it's one that I keep coming back to from my own life. So my friend Rui was in New York City. It was January, it was very cold. And he did not know the area very well. We were staying with friends. He went outside to his car, and somebody had stolen the catalytic converter out of his car. And so he's like, what do I do? So he's wandering around trying to find a mechanic. It's New Year's Day. He can't find a mechanic. And suddenly a guy starts walking towards him and goes, hey man, you want a catalytic converter? And he's like, that's my catalytic converter. You just stole it out of my car. And he's like, well, do you want it or not? Right. And it's an imperfect analogy, but I think it is not inapt, it's perhaps inept, I think it's not inapt. But the point being that she's being presented a gift. Okay, 5 minutes. Okay, speed up. She's being presented a gift as though her labor had nothing to do with the production of those pills, as if she shouldn't have any claim on them. And I would say this whole move of gift and gifting and the circulation of books and different kinds of books of gifts are really central to the book. But in this particular case, I would say what feels particularly egregious is the way this gesture is packaged as though she should be grateful, but also as though she should not be upset about what has happened to the knowledge that she helped produce, as though this entity that for her was not an object has been objectified. There's a kind of violence that's happened there. There's a profound set of extractions and objectifications and dislocations and erasures that happen in the context of that story, but it's presented as though it's a happy story and that she should be therefore grateful despite this sort of reiterative loop of extraction. And I want to point out also before I want to close, not with this, but with, oops, I had a couple of pictures to show you there. So that one, that's the only one I didn't show you. I'm fine. So there's a direct link, I would say, to that way of telling the story, that way of narrating the past, to something like this, right? So I'm coming back to Skapastora now, and I'm going to close with Skapastora, but not with this, because I want to close with something else. So this is now a Thai Beckley, but I couldn't find any press releases that sort of had the new company name. One of the largest psychedelic companies in the world that has a subsidiary that is focused specifically on Skapastora and especially on Salvia divinorum, on Salvinorin A. Does anybody recognize the man in the picture? Peter Thiel, right? Who is a lead backer of Atai Life Sciences, who obviously has a great deal of political influence as well. So in this context, I would say the extraction feels rather dramatically different when you have this being a vehicle by which a billionaire, one of the richest men on earth, will be able to make more money when people from the Sierra have made nothing. It's a particularly egregious form of extraction, and that's why I think this story matters. But I don't want to end with them. I want to end with this, in part because in case the extraction and the violence isn't clear enough, this is where I want to end. So this is the article that, where's my water? This is the article that kind of announced the discovery of Skapastora, otherwise known as Salvia divinorum, to the world. And there's this passage in it that I want to briefly read, because this is one of the women, one of the kinds of indigenous figures that have had a lot to do with the discovery of and knowledge about these plants that are really erased from most narratives. I'm out of time. I'm almost done. And I want to kind of bring her back into this conversation and bring her back into public consciousness for just a minute. So let me briefly read this passage. A day or two before the events I have narrated, which is to say it was the first velada that he took with Skapastora, the curandera Maria Sebastiana Carrera had supplied us with many details about the use of the leaves and had even chanted the words of the ceremony after her usage. She had declined to admit us to an actual ceremony because her neighbors and doubtless she herself would have considered the performance before outsiders a desecration and scandalous. Even as it was, when her session with us was drawing to a close, she burst into uncontrollable tears and begged for forgiveness for what she had done. She had also given us valuable cosmological legends that are still believed in among the villagers, which I hope to publish elsewhere. And I will say that the archival correspondence between him and a woman named Irmgard Weitlander, who also did an awful lot to sort of help him, makes even clearer, because she was there, just how incredibly traumatized this woman was, right? I mean, how clearly she was being coerced. I don't know any other word to use for it. But notice he doesn't miss a beat. He doesn't skip a beat between, she was really hella distressed, but, chop, chop, I'm going to go publish some stuff, right? And my point would be that kind of normalization of scientific extraction and knowledge also connects directly to the current state of affairs and the place that Indigenous people and Indigenous voices have in the current status of psychedelics. So that's why I think history matters. And that's why I'm going to close with a charge, which is to ask you to think about how you retell the stories about the past of psychedelics. To think more carefully about the stories you tell, because the stories we tell about the past really do shape the present. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Paja. So we have Maria. Click, yeah, it'll go.
Okay.
Yeah, just use this side.
Okay.
Forward.
So, first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for this invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here discussing my work. Some words, I think, about me first. I am an historian of science and technology. My research has been focused on the history of coffee in colonial Angola. I have always been more interested in production than in consumption. How did the coffee grow? What farming practices were used? How did it become a commodity? How did it travel to the fast-speeding societies of post-World War II? What difference in terms of labor regimes between Arabica coffee, for example, and Robusta coffee? So these were my questions, and not the coffee stimulant properties that affect individuals and communities. How I write is history of production has always been at the intersection of the history of science and history of technology, and the environmental history and colonial history. In practice, my work has been always trying to convince colonial historians that we can only fully understand how empires are built and maintained if we take into consideration the interconnections and the interdependencies between humans and non-humans. In the case of Angola coffee, in order to understand the history, the argument is that in order to understand the history of slavery and forced labor, we need to go deep in the forests where the plantations were set up, and also deep in the forest science that put these forests in the service of the empire. Of course, that, as it often happens, when we do that, the agency of those actors that are more dependent from this more than human world is also coming to the surface. And again, in my case, it was, I forgot, sorry. And in my case, it was the agency of small African growers. So I could say that the thread of my running through all my work has been to decenter from the human subject, and in doing that, to deconstruct the narratives about science, state, and empire. And I think this is important, and sorry for this big introduction, because it's important to understand what I'm going to talk about today, and how I entered the history of psychedelics, and a lot of things that I don't understand about the state of the art. Also explaining, it also helps to explain why in entering the history of psychedelics, I want to enter in the history of consumption, but without losing sight of the history of production. Another thing, this is also I'm also very new in this field. This research has 1 year. I started to research on rye ergot, 1 year ago, but I'm thinking about many of these things for 3 years, I think, because I enter a pressure group in Lisbon to include psychedelics in medicine. And in that environment, I saw two sides of the Portuguese society that I never saw in the same room, and they were laughing and communicating. And one, it was psychiatrists, psychologists, lawyers, politicians, and then it was the holistic therapists, tantra therapists, holotropic breath work facilitators, sound healing. So all these also, when I was thinking, and we were having a lot of conversations and discussions, I thought that if I wanted to do the history of psychedelics, I did not want to do the history of psychedelic science. I wanted to go to the other side. So when I look to the history of psychedelics produced during the second wave, I see two major groups: those who study the history of psychedelics, psychedelic practices in indigenous societies, and those who study the emergence of psychedelic science in Western societies, particularly in Europe and the United States. What is clearly missing from this historiographical effort is the history of vernacular uses of psychedelic plants that are native to Europe. And some examples are, I'm sorry, I'm always late with the slides. So this is what I see, the state of the art. And some examples of these plants are, for example, the solacinous plants, Atropa belladonna, Datura stramonium, or Josianus niger. These three are very well known from the history of witchcraft. And of course, many mushrooms. The most obvious is Amanita muscaria. But then I put this also here, this Panaeolus, because Robert Graves, he mentions in his book as a small dung mushroom still used in by Portuguese witches, and similar in effect to mescalina. So something that I would like to find out more. And then, of course, the fungus rye ergot that, as you know, gave rise to LSD in 1942. I think there is still a difference between the first wave and the second wave. And maybe I would like to discuss a little bit more these, because in the first wave, I think that despite the focus being also in the psychedelics originating from the indigenous territories, there was a clear interest in contributing to what had been the psychedelic history and culture of Western societies. For example, the most obvious is Albert Hofmann's work on Ergot as the origin of that ritual drink of Mysterious of Eleusis in ancient Greece. And I don't see these interests being carried over in the second wave, and I'm still trying to understand why. But if we could discuss this later, it would be great. So, despite this organization of the historiography, there is literature, although it's scattered across several disciplinary fields. I identify two bodies of literature. The first deals with the use of plants for alteration of consciousness and is dispersed across history of drugs, anthropology, ethnobotany, mycology, archaeology, and the history of witchcraft, which I have to thank also Christian Greer in his article. Is mentioning Edward Beaver, and it was really helpful for me. And then a second group of literature, which I don't see it being discussed in the history of psychedelics, which deals with the use of plants for reproductive control, and is also dispersed across a lot of different scholars with very different background, but more or less literature of contraception, literature of plant science, and feminist history. And this second body of literature, I found it because many of psychedelic plants are also abortion-inducing plants, so they share a past. And one example is Tropa Belladonna, for example, and Rye Ergot. So now all this literature underscores, particularly the second, but the first also, underscores women's central role in the preservation and transmission of knowledge about these plants, and also the processes of silencing and delegitimation of these women because of that knowledge. So my question is, what histories remain obscured when we set aside or we assume that did not exist the vernacular uses of psychedelic plants native to Europe? And this is the question, this is the question around my new project was designed, and of which this paper is the first output. But before going further to the findings of the Portuguese case, I would like to give. I thought about it, but I think it's important because I didn't know what was my. What do you know about Rye Ergot? So my case study it shrinks, but I think this is important because of the story of Rye Ergot in science, but also because it makes a material link to my Portuguese case. So the most important thing to understand about Ergot, and again, I'm not seeing this discussed, but please tell me if I'm wrong, is that it enters science not through the brain, but through the uterus. It was from observing the practices of peasant women and midwives who use it both as an abortion-inducing substance and to control labor that scientific interests arose. The earliest known record of these practices dates from the 16th century. The name that German people give to Rye Ergot, Mutterkorn, that probably you know, mother grain, reveals the role it played in Europe popular culture. From that point on, science kept this fungus under close watch. Of course, it was a fungus that controlled human reproduction. In the 19th century, scientists established that ergot acted on uterine, I think I'm saying the word right, uterine contractions, which explained why humans use it to both or induce abortion or to facilitate childbirth. From the second half of the 19th century, its history follows what many other abortion-inducing substances of many other abortion-inducing plants in Europe. Abortion was criminalized. These plants were considered classified as poison. Women accused of taking these plants were faced sentence that could include lifelong forced labor. And so Ergot moved from the fields and from the peasants into the laboratories and to the hospitals, where it could continue to interact with female body, but under now the close watch of physicians who learn how to use it in childbirth and to perform abortions when they decided it was important, it was convenient or important to do. During the first decades of the 20th century, the active substances of ergot, and they call it ergo alkaloids, were isolated by one by one, giving rise to drugs that became central to gynecological and obstetric practice. It is in this context of an emerging obstetric industry and an accelerating dependency of women on science for control their reproductive cycles that Hoffman path crossed with Ergot in Sandoz laboratories in Switzerland, when in 1935 he asked Stoll, his boss, if he could start to work on Ergot. It had been Stoll who in 1918 had isolated the first ergo alkaloid with therapeutic potential, ergotamina. And this ergotamina entered clinical practice very rapidly under the name of Ginergen. Oh my God. The research line at Sandoz was abandoned at the time, but Hoffman wanted to restart it. However, when he was wanting to restart the work on Ergot, he asked Stoll if he could use the material, and Stoll said no. There was no. It was too expensive, his ergotamine, and so Hoffman had an idea. And he decided that he was going to use other material that was there in the laboratories, and it was Portuguese ergot. And we can read this in his book, LSD, My Problem Child. This means that the synthesis of lysergic acid in 1938, the first in a sequence of experiments that would culminate in the synthesis of LSD in 1943, was based on samples of ergot that came from Portugal. It should be noted that it was not by random that these Portuguese ergot samples were in the laboratories of Sandoz. Portugal was already at that time one of the main producers of ergot in Europe, together with Spain, Poland, and Russia. With the beginning of the Second World War II, the position of Portugal in the global market became even more central. And we can see here in a note from Nature, this committee, U.S. War Committee, saying that the world outside Germany and certain mid-European countries was dependent mainly upon the diminished output of Portugal. So now I will. I maybe skip this slide, but just give an idea. This is from a region in Portugal that calls Trás-os-Montes. The translation is behind the hills. So it's traditionally in the historiography and in imaginary of Portugal, always one of the most undeveloped regions in the country. It's very poor. The nature is very hard. There's a lot of community life that was constructed and organized to face these difficulties. Very few states, and so it's this region that is giving this ergot to this multi-millionary pharmaceutical industry that want these things for obstetric medicine. But I will skip this and just very, very fast, and then I just go to my conclusion. What I discovered about production is that it was mainly, so there is no industrialization. There was in other countries, but not in Portugal. It's just spontaneous grow of ergot, and it is gathered, I think it's like that, gathered, collected by women and children mainly. The sources, archival sources, are very few because this is not present. This is very strangely not present in the sources of the agricultural scientists. So this is like a very important region for common lands, and it's from where it's also from there that it comes this ergot production, but somehow this is being erased or from the archive. I have some archival work dispersed, and then I have a lot of testimonies from oral history. I have some. So, and then I have another slide that I will also don't have time to talk, but it's about, here I have a lot of sources from medical sources in Portugal, and basically it's a classic witch hunt process in relation to midwives. So they are appropriating all the knowledge as women that are pregnant are coming to the hospital. So there is a lot of, we can see how the ergot is moving from the fields to the hospitals and to the medical knowledge. But at the same time, we see how they are producing all the texts and discourses saying that midwives are ignorant, that midwives don't know anything, etc. And then we also see, which is also very normal, when we have this repressing this kind of sources, is that at the same time that we see the process of silencing and the repression, we also see that it existed. So we see that they continued this was a practice, and European women knew very well how to deal with this fungus, this psychedelic fungus. So I will just very short say my work contends that contemporary psychedelic renaissance, by positioning a sharp historical discontinuity between LSD and its fungal precursor, and also by not seeing other plants native to in Europe, helps to perpetuate much older elimination of women's vernacular knowledge of psychoactive plants and its replacement by scientific knowledge. This erasure also serves psychedelic capitalism. It is easier to frame psychedelics as either ancestral indigenous traditions located somewhere elsewhere and far away, or as a product of a cutting-edge biomedical science, than to acknowledge a specifically European psychedelic culture rooted in criminalized practices of reproductive control. This paper mobilized the notion of the witch, as recent feminist literature has recasted, and I'm talking more about Silvia Federici, to rethink process of in which women were silenced and their knowledge legitimated. Ultimately, the paper highlights the importance of material history and feminine history to reconfigure the scales and temporalities of psychedelic history, and in doing so to challenge dominant narratives of what counts as psychedelic past. Thank you.
Maria.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for being here, and thank you to the organizers and everyone for inviting me and for all the hard work that went into putting this together. I'm Jason Helscher. As it says, I'm a professor of interdisciplinary art at Georgia Southern University. So my paper. Why do psychedelic journeys, like a deep immersion in an artistic experience, often feel so simultaneously rich in meaning, yet impossible to articulate to others? In this paper, I explore the question of how psychedelic states reorganize both perception and communicative capacity to posit that psychedelic experience operates not only as a reservoir of imagistic and psychosomatic effects, but also as a reconfiguration of the mind's information architecture, not only a reordering of perception, but also of communicative possibility. Drawing on information theory, complex adaptive systems research, and aesthetic philosophy. And as an aside, this is my first attempt at integrating ideas from my book, Art as Information Ecology, which I'll talk about in a minute, and a forthcoming book titled Art is the Butterfly Effect of Itself. So combining all of these together, I investigate how psychedelics behave as a peculiar kind of information technology, using the core definition of information as a mode of difference, whose primary effect is the modulation of entropy across perceptual and conceptual channels. Here we find a zone where familiar interpretive regimes can no longer contain the weight of experience, much less of the social viscosity of communication, as the relative entropic constraint architectures that ordinarily stabilize meaning are loosened. By reframing psychedelic consciousness as both an information and aesthetic operation, my goal here is to demonstrate how such states generate novel communicative and perceptual capacities, while simultaneously exceeding everyday linguistic capture, catalyzing what I will show, or at least propose, as a type of subjective singularity, a recalibration of how we can engage the world's complexity in an era otherwise relentlessly oriented towards streamlined quantification. Under ordinary conditions, cognition seems to operate through a series of constraint architectures that stabilize meaning by reducing the range of possible interpretations, what Aldous Huxley called a reducing valve, or what cognitive psychologist Donald Hoffman terms a species-specific interface through which, quote, perception is not reconstruction, it is construction of a niche-specific, problem-specific, fitness-enhancing interface, end quote. These constraints, in other words, function as a kind of perceptual economy, filtering out noise, and allowing the organism to act efficiently within its environment. Psychedelics, of course, loosen these constraints, as the filtering mechanisms that ordinarily regulate perceptual input and neural intra and interconnectivity begin to relax. Attention is no longer confined to familiar pathways. Instead, under psychedelics, the brain's maximum potential entropy undergoes a radical expansion, oversaturating one's experiential information potentials as previously latent differences become overt and available for perception and thought. Now, before moving forward, let me define a key term here, namely maximum potential entropy. Maximum potential entropy is one half of Bell Labs engineer Claude Shannon's formalization of information theory, the communication protocols and compression algorithms that run everything from our smartphones, internet, GPS signal relays, and more. In his 1948 monograph, The Mathematical Theory of Communication, Shannon posits information as relative entropy, or the differential relation between maximum potential and actual entropy. And you'll notice on the left, the journal version is A Mathematical Theory of Communication. By the time it comes out in book form, he's decided he's really got it figured out. So it's The Mathematical Theory of Communication. I believe the original paper is, at least, I think it's still the single most cited paper ever, as far as I understand. But back to the definitions. Maximum potential entropy describes the maximum interchangeability or entropy of a set of options available for selection, such as the random set of alphabet letters, let's say. Actual entropy, on the other hand, describes the structured result of a selection made from or chosen from that set of options, such as a word constructed from that random jumble of alphabet letters. Oversimplifying for clarity, maximum potential entropy means the number of options available for selection within a system. A coin toss has only 2 heads or tails, so that it has a maximum potential entropy of 2. Multiple choice quiz with 4 options has a correlatively larger maximum potential entropy of 4, while a questionnaire with 10 options has a still larger entropic range of 10, and so on and so on. There's a reason companies want you to have lowercase letters, uppercase letters, numbers, and symbols in your password, because each one of those additions adds to the maximum potential entropy, which makes it harder to guess or isolate what that signal might be. These entropic measures, in turn, define the range of difference, surprise, or information invested in and yielded by any given result. Heads is not only heads, but not tails. Not a huge amount of variation there. A 4 from a 6-sided die is 4, not only 4, but also not 1, not 2, not 3, not 5, not 6, and so on. So the bigger the range of alternate possible options, the higher the measure of surprise, and thus the more informationally intensive the actual result will be. Now think in practical terms of a bypassing question in the hallway. Hey, how you doing? How was your weekend? There's a maximum potential entropy there generally of, oh, good, good, how are you? Oh, living the dream, or, whatever. If someone says, oh, it was crazy, I got abducted by aliens, and then, whatever, that's outside the range of maximum potential entropy of normal expectation, brings in more difference, and therefore more information measure. The information measure is intensified in that circumstance. When this range of interchangeable options, AKA the maximum potential entropy, converges with an actual selection, the actual entropy, from the haze of alphabet to an actual word selected, that relative difference between the scale of options and the particularity of the result constitutes what Shannon calls relative entropy, which is what information actually is in a Shannon technical mathematical context. Why do I bring this up in this context? Well, consider this. During a psychedelic experience, the range of things we find worth paying attention to undergoes an exponentially dramatic expansion, which constitutes an increase, a radical increase, and often in maximum potential entropy, not just at the level of the things encountered within our experiential field as information, but also at the level of the experiential field itself. At the level of the experiential field itself. Just as there's more surprise or difference from expectation with a word drawn from a hat than there is from a heads or tails coin toss, which has the option of maximum potential entropy of 2, the word chosen might be one of 10,000 possible words in daily use, therefore with a maximum potential entropy of 10,000. The radical expansion of psychedelicized attention is vastly enriched and amplified. And even the most mundane experiences seem all the more vivid, catalytic, and supersaturated with differential intensity, which I would posit is at least in part because of their radically increasing increase in information investment. Accordingly, when the so-called reducing valve opens and the species-specific interface unfolds beyond recognition, the system does not simply receive more information at the input level, but fundamentally reorganizes how information is distributed, weighted, and integrated at the foundational levels of thought itself. It is at this threshold that psychedelic experience resembles what I call an aesthetic singularity. In chapter 4 of my book, Art as Information Ecology, Artworks, Art Worlds, and Complex Systems Aesthetics, pardon the shameless plug, my editor would be annoyed if I didn't put this up there. But you can also find it for free online, so she would not like that. I propose the notion of an aesthetic singularity to describe those occasional periods of punctuated equilibrium when artistic transformation is so extreme that art in one period, often only a few years later, is so fundamentally different that it would have been impossible even to recognize, much less anticipate or predict from an earlier period. A singularity, of course, is a transition. Can you all hear me? I'm trying to use my teacher voice. I just noticed they use the mic. Sorry about that. I don't like pedestals very much, so I'm trying to be over here. A singularity, of course, is a transition point in which the conditions and operations of a system transform so thoroughly and suddenly as to be incomprehensible from within the framework of a previous state. In physics, the term generally applies to a black hole, black holes, which exhibit such extreme spatiotemporal effects that the laws of physics break down past the event horizon. The term technological singularity has become common in recent years, describing a theorized future point when rates of technological change achieve a transformative intensity beyond which current modes of human understanding will no longer apply. An aesthetic singularity operates similarly. We see this in the relatively small differences between, say, Eurocentric art from 1450 to 1850, a 400-year span, with artists oversimplifying. There's not a huge amount of difference between these works, considering they're separated by 400 years, versus the dramatic transformations across the 60 years between 1850 and 1910. Here, a fairly minor shift of artistic focus from using paint and surface to represent other things to exploring the materiality of paint and surface as things in themselves, that is, from a window to look through on the left to a surface to look at on the right, yields modes of art making we're accustomed to now, but which would have been entirely alien and inconceivable only a few years earlier. The painter from 1850 on the left would have had no idea in that time period what to even make of the Picasso on the right. This is an entirely different set of circumstances. Psychedelics operate with a similar dynamic as parallel systems of experiential reorganization prompted by relatively minor reorientations of emphasis, attentive, chemical, etc. Both art and psychedelics thus generate a kind of experiential surplus, offering a vast range of possible meanings, relations, and interpretations so excessive relative to their physical instantiation that they cannot be fully contained within existing frameworks. Considered this way, one's first psychedelic experience is a kind of subjective singularity in itself, offering a moment within perception where existing interpretive frameworks can no longer sustain typical operation. And what comes after would have been inconceivable within one's previous expectation sets. Categories blur, hierarchies dissolve, and the distinctions between figure and ground become unstable. The result is less chaos than a heightened information-enriched awareness of the world's latent complexity, a condition in which information and meaning proliferate faster than they can be grasped or stabilized. This leads to another overlap of the aesthetic and psychedelic. Borrowing Gregory Bateson's paraphrase of Shannon information as a difference that makes a difference, we can extend the concept to account for the types of recursive, self-propagating systems of differentiation offered by both aesthetics and psychedelics as differences that make a difference that keeps on differencing. That is, like art, psychedelic experience resists settling and offers a longer half-life of transformability, less a mode of information as a thing, as being, which is how it's usually offered in our information extraction economy, and more a mode of information as becoming, as an ongoing process of information sustained in formation. Here, difference does not merely register, but proliferates. A perceived color becomes a pattern becomes a system becomes a metaphor, and the metaphor feeds back into the perception. Similarly, in aesthetic experience, a formal decision can reverberate across multiple levels of interpretation, generating a cascade of relational meanings that exceed any single reading and which feed back to transform the system of relations that made them possible in the first place. As this suggests, these systemic effects are not random, but are structured by the internal dynamics of complex adaptation, in which local interactions give rise to emergent global patterns that are shaped by and in turn shape the local interactions that shape the emergent patterns, the emergent global patterns themselves, and so forth. The system adapts in real time, in other words, unfinalizably reorganizing itself in response to its own unfinalizable outputs, which is why, in part, the same song, poem, or artwork can offer something new with each new encounter, or why every psychedelic experience can seem so different from every other. This brings us to a question from the introduction of the paper of why psychedelic experience is so difficult to describe to others. In my book, I note that one thing that differentiates art experience from other types is its resistance to paraphrasability. I can describe a grocery store poster and say, oh, it shows 3 apples and says 3 apples for $1. And you'll generally get it even without seeing that poster. But if I describe a Cézanne painting of apples as, oh, it's a bunch of apples on a table with weirdly skewed perspective, you'll miss out on a lot of the richness and indeterminacy that makes the experience what it is in the first place. This is because, in part at least, to paraphrase is to reduce, to translate a complex configuration of relations into a more stable, communicable form. But when the experience itself emerges from and as ongoing differentiation, as a difference that keeps on differencing, as with art and as with psychedelics, any attempt at such communication necessarily collapses the dynamics that make the experience what it is in the first place. The artwork becomes an artifact as its complexity and richness is shorn off. And even the best paraphrased psychedelic encounter might capture the residue of the experience, but not the generative logic that drives its dynamic unfinalizability. I lost my place. The contemporary resurgence of interest in psychedelics, particularly within clinical and therapeutic contexts, offers a new site for examining these dynamics. Considered from the perspective I'm developing here, psychedelic therapy can be seen as an intervention into the patient's information ecology, of their entangled information relations between the internal, external, and internal external, as well as the feedback loops between those relations. Set and setting become central components of this information ecology. And what does set and setting mean if not an ecologic feedback relation between selfhood, subjectivity, and situation? In this sense, the therapeutic environment functions as a contextual technology, a technology for revising the experiential grain or texture of one's context. What emerges from this analysis is a shift in how we might understand the relations between psychedelics and aesthetics. While I applaud any renewed interest in this topic, I fear the accelerating emphases on psychedelic commodification and scientification, even to the point of weeding out the visionary aspects to yield a pill focused only on the therapeutic effects, risks removing some of the most important elements of the experience and all their fuzzy, hard to quantify intensity. This seems to me on par with recent decades slashing of school art budgets, simply because art's benefits are too difficult to quantify and therefore don't show up on a spreadsheet. What isn't countable doesn't get counted and eventually ceases to count, to the eventual impoverishment of all. Accordingly, rather than treating psychedelics and aesthetics as separate domains, one pharmacological and the other cultural, I propose we can begin to see them as overlapping means of engaging with complexity in a world oriented increasingly towards streamlined, high granularity certainty. Both operate by loosening constraints, increasing the range of possible relations, and generating an experiential surplus, both on their own terms and in terms of radical expansions of maximum potential entropy. Moreover, both produce forms of knowledge through intensive and iterative ingressions of difference, whether somatic, intersubjective, or intellectual. Both resist reduction to propositional statements and instead require modes of engagement that are processual, relational, and open-ended. Nearing my conclusion, to resist the tide of scientization of psychedelics, or rather not to replace that approach, but to ensure a coexistence of both. And by way of a conclusion, I would like to point out that aesthetic philosophy has a multi-millennia history of trying to figure out, in all caps, what art is and what makes it so weird. Does that sound familiar in terms of psychedelics? And there are some real conceptual, phenomenological, and methodological gems in there that could resonate very strongly with psychedelics research. To give but one example, even so rationalistically rigorous a thinker as Immanuel Kant not only realized the need for a third critique, the critique of judgment, to explore the weirder, fuzzier, indeterminate fringes of human experience, but he realized the best way to do this was through a study of art and aesthetic experience, not because he was interested or even knew anything about art, but because art has historically played similarly problematic, subjective, and social roles as have psychedelics in recent decades. Though beyond the scope of this paper, in particular, I would point out that Kant's claim that aesthetic experience triggers what he calls the free play of the faculties, look it up if you're not familiar, aka the experience of experiencing on its own terms, as well as the other 6 components of his aesthetic system that I'm skipping. The experience of experiencing on its own terms without a grounding object or defined perceptual resolution, which he's talking about as triggered by art, practically begs to be translated into into psychedelic terms. Finally, I should point out that if psychedelic experience foregrounds modes of cognition characterized by continual differentiation, this challenges disciplinary practices that rely on stable categories and definable interpretations. Again, just like art's mercurial ability to transform as soon as someone finally thinks they've got it figured out. To trip the aesthetic singularity, then, is to encounter the limits of our interpretive frameworks and to recognize those limits are not fixed, but are themselves part of a dynamic system subject to reconfiguration and transformation. Psychedelics and and art make this visible by amplifying the role of serial differentiation, or information information, as a mode of information oriented less toward answers and facts than toward questions and possibilities. And in doing so, they remind us that meaning is not only something we inherit or discover, but something we continually produce, negotiate, and reimagine within the complex ecologies of experience we inhabit. Thank you.
Thank you all for those riveting talks. So I think what we're going to do is I'll just quickly ask 2 questions to all of you, and then we can open it up to an audience Q&A. So what I observed or heard in your talks was that there was, in most of them, there was a kind of a concern with ethical stakes and what the ethical stakes of kind of an inequality of epistemological legitimacy is at stake. And we talked about storytelling as a method for mediating credibility, hierarchy, status, power, and there was maybe an implicit concern with justice or injustice, or even explicit. And then we also touched on some undesirable stories, right? So we have the influencers, the information extractors, patriarchs as a kind of an undesirable way of seeing things. And so I'm also interested then in how you all conceive of authenticity within knowledge. So what would constitute legitimate knowledge for you guys? What would, how would we establish the value of marginalized knowledge? So that's the first question. And then the second is, what are desirable psychedelic futures, whether they be ethical or epistemological or practice-based? What do you all want from the psychedelic future?
Everyone's waiting for somebody else. Well, your first question, yes, sorry. The first question was what, can you repeat the first question in simple terms? What constitutes valid knowledge of psychedelics?
Yeah.
I would say briefly, and this is, I'm sure, radically oversimplified, and I'm putting on my professor mode, but I think knowledge and this relates in part to the first paper. I would say knowledge, there's the subjective component and the socially constructed component that leads to influencers and so forth. But speaking as a teacher or as a professor or whatever the right term is, my subjective experience matters to me, and it gains validity not through being an influencer, but if I can encapsulate and share knowledge of whether psychedelics or whatever other topic with my students or just more generally with others in ways that resonate and offer something for them to resonate with, that's kind of the best of both worlds. I get to bring in something that I think might offer something to somebody else. And then sometimes it resonates, sometimes it doesn't. But the degree of resonance, in my experience, in my opinion, I guess, it's nothing more than that. In my opinion, that degree of resonance is what lends it a validity. If there's something else someone can pick up on and share it further or build upon it or even challenge it so that it reinterprets my take on things, that to me that's as close to a validity, a generative kind of validity or emergent validity as I can think of off the top of my head.
Can I stand up?
Yeah.
I don't, anyway. So I think that this question about, can you all hear me back there? Yeah, right. Oh, for the people on the virtual people, right? Hello, virtual people. I don't believe that you're there.
There.
Like you're like the DMT aliens, right? So I think that this question of authenticity is I mean, really all knowledge systems are humanly constructed. There is no kind of authentic human knowledge whatsoever. I think that I'm looking at Stuart here, like this is just Nagarjuna sort of thing to say, is that there are no epistemic foundations whatsoever. And then to throw in a little Foucault in there is that people claim authenticity so that they can create hierarchies and then obliterate other people, so to speak, recent language, or to just create some kind of chain of command of who's got more authentic knowledge. So I think the whole thing is really suspicious. But that said, what's so ironic about psychedelics is that here's I get the street cred here. And it's funny, I'm going to make an epistemic claim, ironically, is that if you do enough of these things, you really doubt everything, right? And then suddenly you have people who have such authority, and when they claim that they've done all these psychedelics and they have authority, and I think like, well, they just haven't done enough. But so that's my first. So, and then valuation of marginalized knowledge. I mean, it's interesting is that in this particular context here in Harvard is that this is as a one who did my PhD at the Divinity School at the University of Chicago, outsiders were given more authority than insiders. But here in the Divinity School at Harvard, it's about insiders, the inside epistemology, insiders speak. And so there's something peculiar about that. There's something strangely kind of colonial about this. Like, let's give these people their language. And it just becomes another kind of mess, I think. So what's the future?
What do you
well,
want
I said that it's not my job to come up with that.
What's
my job is
to you.
What's that?
What's desirable to you? What is
desirable?
Good life.
To live a good life? Oh God.
What do you want from the psychedelic renaissance?
What do I want from the psychedelic renaissance? What I want is I want people to question their presuppositions, and I wanted them to increase their epistemic humility and recognize that epistemic confidence and epistemic arrogance is not desirable. That's what I want.
Nice.
Hello. Goodbye, aliens.
So is this on? Or do I need to turn it on? It's on? Yeah, okay. I mean, in some sense, I think I already answered how I feel about the first, but I'll say the second question, I guess, in my paper itself. But I mean, I think what I want, I mean, for starters, I this kind of question always makes me uncomfortable, although I totally respect it, in part because people often ask me when I talk about this work, what should I do? And what do you want to see? And my answer is not an easy one. It's that I am not the person to figure that out, right? I mean, it's like, it is not up to me to figure this out. This has to be a collaborative process, and Indigenous people have to have way more of a voice than they have right now. I mean, full stop. So it has to be something that is done in community and giving people who right now don't have much of a voice and don't have a big stake in the conversation, more of a stake. I mean, I think, backing up from that, I think part of what it means is recognizing, the contributions that Indigenous people have made and allowing them to be part. I mean, like, why does the work that a given chemist does or a group of chemists do for a pharmaceutical company that's collective, that is happening over sometimes many decades, certainly many years, that counts as research and development, whereas what Indigenous people do does not count as research and development. I think that is fundamentally wrong. I think that ought to change. So that's part of what I think a psychedelic future ought to look like, is sort of like recognizing how incredibly unfair and tilted the playing field is right now, particularly I think where, exactly the kinds of people who would tend to be more disenfranchised, right? Poor communities, Indigenous communities, I mean, et cetera. That being said, I mean, I feel like I have interviewed enough people and have my own experience of family members and et cetera, of people whose lives have been truly changed for the better through their engagement with psychedelics, that the last thing I want to say is that there shouldn't be exchange of knowledge. There shouldn't be a world in which the psychedelic plants that Indigenous people have taken care of from should not circulate. So that is definitely not what I'm saying either. What I am saying is that I don't think that Peter Thiel ought to be able to get rich. I mean, and it's like, and I could go on all day long, and I'm sure many of you know the story. I mean, it's not just the particular relation. I mean, it's not just a particular company that he funds. It's about the laws that are enacted and the way they intersect with intellectual knowledge, and the way it did, just that's part of what the book is about, these sort of like many layered, complicated processes by which Indigenous people are systematically disenfranchised. And that I think should change. So I guess that would be my answer to the but embedded in that, I suppose, is also, I mean, it's a good question. I'm sitting here thinking about how I think about authenticity. And I think what I don't think is that Indigenous people have a single knowledge and authenticity, among other things, because Indigenous people don't agree with each other. They have different ideas. They fight about it. I mean, at least in my experience, like they fight about it. It's changed over time. So I definitely don't want to live in a world where I feel like there's, one group of people, or like authenticity is one thing. But I do think awareness matters, right? I mean, I think that we ought to be aware of, where your psilocybin mushrooms come from. And who had to pay the price for you to be able to take them. I think that should matter. So for me, authenticity is in part closely tied to, I would say, awareness and knowledge.
Well, I'm an historian of science, so I passed all my life looking very skeptical of what scientists do. And again, in this psychedelic research, I'm again doing the same. And so this does not mean that I don't believe in science. I believe in science. But it's again, legitimate knowledge comes from making questions, accepting that this is all constructed, but making questions until the end. So especially when the authority is with scientists. I'm quite optimist about no, I'm not optimist at all about the future, but I see something good in psychedelic since I entered this psychedelic world and discussions and thinking about knowledge. And as I was saying, it was like 3 years ago. And it has to do with that image of these places from where I come from, when suddenly completely, I could not imagine that all that people could be in the same room with me, discussing and sharing all their experiences. So we have all these scientists and politicians and lawyers and all the experts in Portugal, and you have the holistic and the tantra and the holotropic. And this is, come on, this is really, I have to say that it's really a way of constructing knowledge, of making questions, of humildad, that I cannot say in English, I don't know, humble, to be humble. And so I think I'm going to be 50 this year, and I think this is really, I never experienced that in my life. And so it's, I'm very, in that part, I'm very positive.
cswr.hds.harvard.edu. Copyright 2026. The President and Fellows of Harvard College.